and welcome to another exclusive live event from The Economist. I'm Zanny Minton Beddoes, the paper's editor-in-chief, and we're here today again to discuss the latest from the war in Ukraine. This is, I have to say, the 15th of these Ukraine webinars that we have held, and it is the last one this year. But there is a huge amount to talk about. And so I'm pleased to be joined once again by my deputy, Ed Carr, Shashank Joshi, our defense editor, and Arkady Ostrovsky, our Russia editor. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Arkady, I wanted to start with you because you have just been in Ukraine. You met with President Vladimir Zelensky, but also with General Valery Zaluzhny, head of the armed forces, who gave you an extremely rare interview, and with Alexander Syrsky, another top general. And collectively, these briefings have offered us, I think, pretty unique access to the thinking amongst Ukraine's top commanders, and it is sobering. It is the package of our cover package this week. We have written about it at great length. We published transcripts, edited transcripts of the interviews. Arkady, tell us first two things. How did you manage to get these interviews? Because particularly General Zaluzhny really doesn't talk to anyone. And secondly, give us the headlines of what they told you.
Thank you, and it's great to be back on this webinars, and thank you for your interest. So I wanted to go to Kyiv. I wanted to go before Christmas and when the temperatures drop and get cold and get a sense of what's happening. I'm not going to disclose all my secrets of how I get to this interviews, but let's put it this way. Ukraine is a democracy. It's an open country. I think it's partly a tribute to the not just our coverage, but to the attention that the world has given to Ukraine and the understanding amongst Ukrainian military, in particular, of the role played by the allies. So I don't take credit really for all of that. And I think Zaluzhny and Zelensky have probably appreciated some of the media support they've been getting from the West. So Ukraine is, as I said, is extraordinary, the access you get, and it's one of the journalists' dreams in a way to operate there. And I hope what they're saying is reflected in our coverage sort of fairly. In terms of the headlines, so I met President Zelensky in his office. He's no longer in the Situation Room where Zanny and you and I saw him last at the end of March. He's now in his proper office. He's settled into routine. He said he's reading 20 pages a day, 6 o'clock in the morning. He looked quite tired. His message is very clear. Ukraine is not going to stop until it gets to the borders, or the war is not going to stop until Ukraine gets to the borders of 1991. Freezing the conflict now would be very dangerous. It would have the same result as happened in 2015. When the conflict in Donbass was frozen, and it would simply give Russia time to regroup, rebuild, and attack again. And they don't want this to happen again, and so they will go all the way to 1991 borders, and that's what people want. And from the beginning, of course, he has been sort of people's president. He's led by what they want as much as he's leading them. Valery Zaluzhny actually is not miles apart from that. I mean, he's very much part of that message politically, is that the war, but for his own reasons, that the war needs to carry on, and freezing the lines now would be very dangerous because he is certain that Russians are already rebuilding somewhere behind the Urals, both in munition and manpower, and they are preparing for a fresh offensive. And he said this could come possibly as soon as end of January, possibly in March, if they're lucky, and most likely in February. And he's fearing attack or counteroffensive in several directions. In the south, in the east, he said the Russians could go again and threaten Odessa and Nikolaev, and as well as in the direction of Belarus and Kyiv. He was talking about some 200,000 Russian troops, which would upset his plans and frustrate his plans to continue to liberate territory. And he said, yes, they might not be up to scratch. It will not be the same force as we saw in 2004, in February 2022, but it would be enough to frustrate his troops, and his troops are also bleeding and exhausted, and he needs a pause, and he needs more munition. So that's basically, I would say, the headlines.
Thank you. We will come on to President Zelensky's repetition of his determination that Ukraine needed to go back to the 1991 borders, which of course would include then retaking Crimea. And we'll assess that a little later in this webinar. But first, let's focus on the second part of what you said, which is this warning that Russia is preparing another offensive that could come as early as January or close to the spring. It could come from any direction and might include an attempt to retake Kiev for the second time. Shashank, as you unfortunately weren't able to be in Kiev for those briefings, but you did read the transcripts and then you co-wrote the briefing, the excellent briefing with Arkady that we published this week. As you read those transcripts, as you sort of built the picture of what Ukraine's generals were telling us, what was your reaction? And what do you make of their assessment of the likelihood of another Russian offensive?
There has been, Zanny, I think, a great deal of derision in the West over Russian mobilization. We see social media pictures of Russian conscripts fighting without boots, without equipment, without ammunition, and all of that's correct, all of that's true. I think the danger is we don't know what we can't see. And the message we heard from Zaluzhny particularly is the message I've heard from other countries. I think I've heard it in Finland when I was there a few months ago. I've heard it from officials in Estonia. I've heard it from other countries, which is that mobilization is more successful than we think. And I think that's true in two senses. It's true in the sense that it is already complicating Ukraine's offensive options. What General Sersky told our Arkady and our other colleague Oliver Carroll was that the flood of newly mobilized men was already slowing down his advances in Luhansk province around places like Svatova, which is where Ukraine is principally on the attack. And the warning we are getting is that these forces Russia is amassing may be sufficient for offensive options. I had previously been relatively skeptical that Russia would be able to regenerate offensive capacity in the spring, perhaps even in the early summer. I still keep an open mind because, of course, these are assessments, they can be wrong. But I think the warnings we're hearing and are echoed by some of the Western officials we are also talking to, Ed, Arkady and I, suggest there is still a prospect of these larger attacks either fixing Ukrainian forces in place and therefore obscuring or stymieing their ability to recapture territory themselves, or could even break through Ukrainian lines in places. There are very, very high levels of uncertainty here, but I think that's the takeaway that I get from these assessments.
As you say, this is a somewhat different picture to the one that one might have formed, and indeed I think many people in the West have formed after what seems like a relatively triumphant autumn, the liberation of Kherson and so forth. So when you hear that, which areas are you most worried about? I mean, I recognize that I'm asking you to second guess Ukraine's commanders themselves, but are there particular areas that our subscribers should focus on, that we should focus on as being a vulnerability?
Well, there's a lot of emphasis on Belarus right now, and there has been heightened military activity in Belarus. We saw that Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, was there. Arkady, you might correct me, but I think Putin is due for a visit there very shortly as well. And there is a sense that an attack could come from the north. Now, what we have been told is that Belarus has probably given away too much of its supplies, ammunition and other material, to the Russians to conduct an attack itself or to take part in one. And I am skeptical that we would see a serious attempt from the north. But I think there are other options. And if you look at where Russia has focused its offensive power right now, the only place on this 1,000-kilometer front that it is still attacking right now is in a place called Bakhmut, which is in Donetsk province. And that is on the road to the bigger cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. And if you're looking at this from the perspective of Vladimir Putin, who says, what do I want to take most of all? The bit that he doesn't have is the rest of Donetsk province. And taking that would allow him to say he has liberated or captured the entirety of Donbass. He has been throwing troops into this meat grinder in Donbass, in Bakhmut, for months. But if he is able to use these hundreds of thousands of mobilized recruits and train them into effective units, which is still a relatively sizable if. If that's correct, then one serious option would be trying to finally obtain that breakthrough in Donetsk and break through to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. I'd be looking very carefully over there. If you look at Kherson in the south, they are building defensive positions, fortifications, trenches, tank traps. It looks to me like they are going to stay on the defensive in the south for quite a while to come.
Can I just interrupt there and ask, perhaps that I should have done this earlier, that our map is brought up, because it would just so that our subscribers and viewers can see where you're talking about. I mean, this map is now painfully familiar to all of us, but just now that everyone can see what you're talking about, quickly highlight the main points again. Yes. Where is... Go ahead.
Well, let's start from sort of west and go east. If you look at Kherson, this is the area that Ukraine liberated with very effective use of the deep battle, striking Russian command posts, bridges, ammunition supplies. But of course, the same obstacle that made it difficult for Russia to resupply its position in Kherson will now make it difficult for Ukraine to cross that river, the Dnipro, onto the left bank. And so Russia in Kherson, on the left bank of the river, the red bit on the south, is building those defensive positions. And I think, you can see it moving on to the defensive. If you then go all the way east, you can see the town of Bakhmut in Donetsk, and that's the place, along with it, particularly to the south, where Russia is throwing its offensive power. And then Luhansk, a little bit further north, we don't have it labeled, but the town of Svatove and the surrounding area is where Ukraine is on the offensive. And if you were a Ukrainian commander assessing your options in terms of an offensive, you could, for example, redouble your resources in Luhansk, where you have been seeing promising gaps open up in the Russian line, just as they did in Kharkiv back in September. But I think the really ambitious place for a Ukrainian offensive, and General Zaluzhny talked about this to Arkady, would be Melitopol, as you can see back in the middle of the map, in Zaporizhia province, south of Zaporizhia, because if the Ukrainians were able to advance about 84 kilometers to Melitopol, they would be able to get their HIMARS rocket launchers within range of Russian supply lines running east-west all the way from Russian territory to Crimea in the so-called land bridge. So from a Ukrainian perspective, that is where we would most expect a Ukrainian offensive. But of course, that is not the place where commanders always like to deploy their forces if it's too predictable or obvious.
Ed, can I turn to you now? Because we've all been absolutely fascinated by these briefings and puzzling over the discrepancy, or indeed the difference between these briefings and what the sort of rest of the world was thinking about Ukraine's position right now. And of course, we're also not naive, and so there is clearly, I'm sure, there is an agenda in us being given these briefings. What do you think? Can you sort of explain how you think about the divergence in views between Kiev and the West? And is it really just that Ukraine is basically pushing for more weapons faster? Or just talk us through how you think about the significance of this.
Yes, Zanny. Well, I think that the push for more weapons is obviously part of it, but there's more to it than that. The way I see it, there's a sort of narrative goes round the West, and one reason for trying to encourage Ukraine to seek peace is because people are worried about escalation. But the other is that we are sort of in 1914 or 15, and we're entering into a very long, ugly war in which neither side makes real advances, and many tens of thousands of lives are lost. To know, and at the end of it, you just kind of still make peace. And some people, their assessment is that neither Russia nor Ukraine can really make advances, and so this is the time to go for peace. And possibly even, in the very long run, Russia starts to gain more of an upper hand. So this is the time to go for peace. And I think what we've heard both from President Zelensky and from Zaluzhny is that that's the wrong way to think about it. Zelensky's part of the argument is that if you freeze things now, you're just setting up the next Russian attack that could be very dangerous. And Zaluzhny bolsters that with the thought that actually, this attack could be really quite ambitious, and we need to prepare for the worst. So it is an argument for weapons, but it's also an argument against those who are starting to design peace now. It's too early for peace, they say. We can't trust Russia. And there's one more point I'd make, which comes very clearly from Zelensky, which is that any frozen conflict depends upon security guarantees from the West, so that Russia doesn't attack again. And he points out clearly that those security guarantees, which Ukraine got when it surrendered the Soviet nuclear weapons that had been on its territory when it became an independent state, those guarantees proved to be utterly worthless when Russia started to seize Ukrainian territory. So he doesn't trust them now, in which case he needs to solve this problem now as much as possible. So that's what's really going on. It's a retort to the people, the voices that keep on coming up in the West. They bubble up, then they go down, because essentially the West doesn't feel it can impose a peace on Ukraine, either politically or even sort of physically. But it's a response and a retort to those arguments.
Thank you. I'm going to dwell a little bit longer on these briefings, simply because they are quite an important new set of bits of information that have really just come out this week. And Arkady, I want to go back to you and ask you a bit more about General Valery Zaluzhny, because he's the one whose words and whose insights really we haven't had the benefit of until now. And I found reading the transcript of your interview really fascinating, particularly the way that he spoke about Vladimir Putin and the explanation he gave for the sort of logic he understood behind what the Russians were doing. Can you just give our viewers a bit more of an insight on that?
Yes. So Valery Zaluzhny, who told me he studied Russian military literature. He, of course, understands the language. He's actually a Russian speaker initially. And I think, has quite a good understanding, as we have seen in this war, about what Russian intentions are, what they're doing. He's, in a way, talking to his counterparts. He's studied the same books. He's been through the same academies. So he can read their mind, in a way, and their actions, and interpret them in a way better than many people can do in the West. And what struck me about Zaluzhny, that he's not just kind of just a good soldier, as people say. He is actually a thinker. He is a thinker and he's a strategist, and he keeps in his mind the big picture, and he's got a very interesting, reflective mind. I found, we talked for more than an hour, and it was a real sort of interaction. And he goes back to the very beginning of this war. He looks at the big picture and the objectives that Putin had set. And those objectives were not just about grabbing a bit of Donbass territory. And in his view, were not even clearly about just even land bridge to Crimea. Putin went to Ukraine to topple the government, to change the identity of the country, to subjugate it to Russian rule. And in that sense, war is a continuation of politics. Now, he told me that in his calculation, having seen what he's seen on the battleground, Russia had enough resources for about 3 months, which sort of tallies with what we understood it to be. In fact, quite generous, because Putin thought he would probably succeed in about 2 or 3 weeks. He says that all those resources which Russia has been building up for 3.5 years or 4 years has now been completely exhausted, squeezed out. But the political goal has not been achieved. And he believes, looking at Russia, that Putin is not going to stop, that he cannot, and his generals are not going to go back to him and saying, you know what, this is not achievable, we should just kind of stop it and settle for what we can. So they will continue to build resources for completing that goal. In his view, just simply stopping Ukrainian forces from advancing, pinning them down, and frustrating their own plans for advance will be sufficient to prolong this war, to wear out the West. And so his idea is that Ukraine needs to continue to advance in order to show success, in order to get more arms, and it needs to prepare for the worst, because in a way Russian forces and Russian intentions have been already underestimated once in February 2022. He doesn't want to do that again. So his idea is that Putin will continue, the political logic will continue to drive Russian forces. And the only way he can succeed is to frustrate those political goals, to get, as Shashank explained, to the borders of Crimea, and to show that the deterrent is such that he now has the ability to strike at Crimea that deterrent is escalation. So it's not that the Russians will have enough force to overrun Kyiv. He doesn't think that. But it's that Russia will frustrate them enough to continue to liberate territory and therefore draw the support of the West to avoid the scenario which Ed has painted.
Thank you. So you can see why we all found this such a fascinating but really sobering set of briefings. The real assessment, I think, from the Ukrainians that there is a looming Russian offensive could come from pretty much any direction, could include a second attempt on Kyiv, and the logic that in order to push back, the Ukrainians really have to try and push to the south, and that a frozen conflict right now, or freezing right now, would be extremely dangerous. Shashank, we've had a lot of questions come in about the technical weaponry sort of side of the consequences from this conversation, which is where I'm turning to you. Gyro and Keith, among others, have asked about America's reported decision to supply Ukraine with Patriot missile defense system. First of all, is this a done deal? Secondly, how long will it take to get up and running? And thirdly, an additional question on it from me, how much difference would it make to have one Patriot missile defense system?
So it's not a done deal. President Biden has yet to approve it. And I think to approve it, he's going to have to be given assurances that, first of all, this won't affect America's defense commitments elsewhere, because the US has pretty small number of Patriot batteries, and they are some of the most in-demand systems the US military has anywhere. Missile defense is becoming increasingly important, particularly in Asia, because of China's enormous arsenal of medium-range ballistic missiles. In addition to that, he has to be given assurances that the Ukrainians can use them. How long will it take? The honest answer is we don't know, because it depends on how long Ukrainians may or may not have been trained on these systems. We don't know that. But these are more complex and difficult than some of the other systems that the Ukrainians are operating so far. And if you think about a single Patriot battery, it takes about 90 people to operate and maintain. That's a fair number of people to train in something that could be quite technical and demanding. So that's worth bearing in mind. Now, what difference will it make? The important thing to understand is that most of the air defense systems that have been sent to Ukraine so far, so think of the NASAMS system given by America, the Norwegian-American system, or the IRIS-T SLM given by Germany, these are very effective against cruise missiles. Cruise missiles are essentially planes. They fly low, they fly slow, they have air-breathing engines. Ballistic missiles go up, they're ballistic. They go up and they come down very, very fast. Patriot can handle ballistic missiles, whereas the other ones can't as well, can't really do it very well. And so this is, in a way, an insurance policy, I think, for two things. One is if Russia rapidly increases its stock of ballistic missiles, which is either from its own production or from Iran, which we can discuss on Ukrainian cities and electricity grid, or it's an insurance policy against Ukraine running out of air defense interceptor missiles for its other systems, opening up the skies for Russian jets to return, and Patriot would be effective against those. So I think it would make a very substantial difference under those circumstances, but it would be a very expensive system to use against cheap Iranian drones. That's a very good way to go bankrupt fast, by firing expensive interceptors at those things.
Thanks. Maybe you could give us a little more detail on the kinds of weaponry that the Russians were getting from Iran. Our subscriber William asks, how important and good are those weapons? I mean, is it just drones? Is there more than that? And how much of a difference would this new source of supply make to the Russians?
Well, we're already seeing the difference that these Iranian systems are making to their ability to strike Ukraine's electricity grid. I don't think there have been drones. There was, of course, a major attack today, and there were 13 drones a few days ago. Prior to that, most of the weapons that Russia was using was its own cruise missiles. But the fact that it's able to sustain this rate of launch is down to the supply from Iran. It is important. They're not very good, but they don't have to be good. They only have to be good enough to hit the right things in sufficient numbers. And Russia is now potentially indigenizing the production of those systems. That's going to be a big problem for Ukraine. However, the really big problem would be if Iran makes a decision to supply short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles, things like the Zulfikar system. These are not terribly good. These are certainly not better than Russia's ballistic missiles, but they are numerous. They are available. They are cheap to make. Iran hasn't yet made a decision to supply that, at least from my understanding, and my sources suggest the regime is still debating as to whether it should send that, because it would be a substantial escalation. It would get Israel involved. It would violate UN sanctions. But if it were to do that, it would essentially allow Russia a deeper stock to keep up this rate of relentless attack on Ukraine's cities and Ukraine's infrastructure. And that's a serious, serious problem, as General Zelensky pointed out, because it will affect his ability to protect reserves and the morale of soldiers' families in the rear.
Ed, I wanted to ask you about this possibility of Israel getting involved. One of our viewers, Jeff, asks in the live Q&A, will Iran's increased support for Russia sway Israel to lend more support to Ukraine? What do you think is the diplomacy of this?
It's absolutely fascinating because, Netanyahu has a good relationship with Putin. They developed it over Syria when the two countries had to deconflict. So that there wasn't, any action there, and the Russians were happy to let the Israelis strike Iranian positions in Syria. So there is a relationship there that Netanyahu will want to protect, but at the same time, it's absolutely right as well, as presumably the viewer is pointing out, that one thing that Netanyahu is absolutely obsessed by is Iran's role, and he hates to see that expand. I think it's interesting too that this comes as the government has actually shifted somewhat towards Ukraine. Israel hasn't come out, but it's shifted steadily towards Ukraine over the recent months. And I suspect that the sort of pariah status of Putin is another factor. So it'll be really, really interesting to see. It's something to watch precisely because of the Iranian factor.
And Shashank, one more weaponry question to you, which is General Zelensky basically rattled off a list of things that he needed, and I can't remember it, and I'll probably get the acronyms wrong, but it was essentially a sort of shopping list of weaponry that he would like. How feasible is it, as we hear this potential new offensive from Russia, possible more arms coming from Iran? Is there, and I'm going to put this very simply and crudely, so forgive it, I'm not a defense expert, but is there enough weaponry of the right sort that can be supplied to Ukraine fast enough, even if there were the political will to up it from the West, to be enough?
Yes, in theory, but there are some serious practical obstacles. If you look at Zelensky's wish list, it was 300 tanks, which is considerably more than there are in the British Army. 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, which are essentially armoured vehicles for the protection of infantry as they move over long distances and to the front lines, which is a substantial number, more than most European armies possess, and 500 howitzers. Again, an enormous artillery force. Most European armies, other than Finland, just don't have these kind of stockpiles. They've given away substantial amounts to Ukraine. So it's a lot he's asking for here, and that's unsurprising because he is trying to build or raise a new army corps. A corps is very sizable. It maybe is 10, 12 brigades, which are themselves pretty big units of pretty big formations. However, if you just count up all the equipment available in NATO forces, you will find these numbers. For example, the UK, to give you one example, is retiring Warrior infantry fighting vehicles. We could give these to the Ukrainians. But there are obstacles. The problem really in all of these things is sustainment. If you give the Ukrainians junk, the stuff that you're getting rid of, you're not going to have the spare parts for when these things break down. And they will break down under conditions of intense use in the frozen sub-zero temperatures of Donbass right now, churning up through the mud, with all the sort of lubricants and oil freezing in these conditions. So we have the stuff, but can we help the Ukrainians maintain it? A substantial proportion of their armor right now is not usable because of breakdowns and repair problems and other issues. So this is the real issue. The US is debating what more it can give. It's looking, for example, at Striker armored vehicles. These would be fantastic for kind of reconnaissance units. They're very, very well protected armored vehicles, sort of like the armored vehicles. But the problem really is, can we allow them to sustain this force even if we gave them thousands of vehicles?
Thanks. Let's now turn the camera angle, if you will, to looking at what damage is being done in Ukraine by the current missile attacks from Russia. Arkady, just give us you were there last week. We were in Kiev. What were the conditions like, and what effect is the Russian bombardment having both on Ukraine's economy, but also on the morale of Ukrainians?
Well, it's a good question. I was in Kiev mostly. I was a little bit in other places like Dnipro and Odessa. And the most obvious and immediate things that you see is that when sun sets, and it's quite early, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, outside the city center, most of the cities go dark. There is simply no electricity, or there are severe shortages, and some houses go, and there's apartment blocks, and they go without electricity for 6, 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours. So most of the city is actually dark, apart from the center, which has got lights. Thankfully, everybody's got heating, and the water is operating. Now, since Russia started this barrage, the attack on the power generation, basically 50% of power generation of Ukraine has been lost. That's the capacity that they cannot turn out anymore. So in terms of the kind of day-to-day, you're in Kiev. Kiev seems to be absolutely normal in the center. Cafes are open, restaurants are open. There's opera house that's open, although only for matinee performances, and the number of spectators is limited to 462, I think, which is the number of shelter places they have. So there is, on the one hand, there is a semblance of normal life, shopping centers, malls. In fact, I spoke to the finance minister, and what he found very surprising is in the past 4 months, the VAT receipts, which is a measure of how much people are spending, have gone up by 40%. So people want to spend. With inflation of 30%, it's completely understandable, and they feel they're supporting the war effort by consumption and keeping the economy afloat. And consumption is now one of the main factors. Now, what the electricity shortages and the bombardments of the power generation has also done is now to bring, basically to halt the second largest exporter, the second largest export revenue earner in Ukraine. First, it was agriculture by blocking the ports. Those have been now partly unblocked, although Russia is sabotaging some of the grain export. It's now the second export earner, and that's steel, the metals, iron ore, etc., because there are no powerful enough generators to keep those factories going. So small businesses, medium-sized businesses, even small plants are continuing to operate with diesel generators. There is enormous import of those. I think $120 million worth of those have been imported just in October alone, and that figure is going up. So, but Ukrainians are continuing to go about their business, as I said, particularly in Kyiv. One of the things that is absolutely booming is the co-working places, where IT, which is the third largest export revenue, IT specialists are now sort of quietly sitting and tapping away at their computers, doing clever stuff, working for Israeli, American, European companies. Again, they're benefiting from Starlink, they're benefiting from those diesel generators. So all that's going. But it is, what I found interesting, Zanny, is that and unsurprising, of course, is that after now several weeks of that shelling and electricity shortages, it is of course having effect on people's moods. You come home 7 o'clock in the evening, there is no light, there is very little connection, there is darkness in every sense of the word, and it weighs on your mood. I think people are quite worn out. That is not to say they're not resilient, they are. And the blitz spirit is there, but we should not, this is not a movie, this is the real life, and we should not underestimate the amount of strain, psychological strain people are under.
Ed, when you look at this systematic attempt to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure, not only is it causing immense suffering right now, but it is also clearly massively complicating the eventual task of reconstruction. And people are already turning to reconstruction. I think there's a conference coming soon to start to talk about this. How much is has this sort of latest approach by Vladimir Putin, essentially just to kind of destroy the entire electricity system, how much is that changing Ukraine's sort of medium-term prospects?
Well, it obviously increases the amount that has to be done. And we think at the moment the economy is down between 30 and 40%. It shows you that economies are surprisingly adaptable. As Arkady says, grain exports are down 40% or so because of the sort of artificial inspections that Russia's imposing on grain. As you look forward to what happens, it strikes me that aid will get you some of the way there, but what you really want is private capital coming in. And private capital will come into a resourceful country if people feel that the long-term investments and FDI is going to produce a return. And this goes straight back to what President Zelensky was telling us. If people feel that this is a frozen conflict and it's just a matter of time before more rockets come in, and when they come in they start taking out infrastructure one more time, it won't be rebuilt very well. You won't get private capital coming in. You'll have people anxious and not prepared to invest. If, however, the peace, when it eventually comes, is a credible peace, then at that point you will get capital coming in, so long as people feel that Ukraine is able to form a government that's reasonably uncorrupt and reasonably reliable. So there is enormous scope for things to improve really quite quickly, and that's partly through government aid, but as I say, largely through private capital. But I think one of the consequences of this bombardment is not just to increase the amount of recovery that needs to be done and investment in infrastructure that needs to be done before these things can get going, but it increases a sense of vulnerability. That means a frozen conflict does not see Ukraine recover rapidly. And if Ukraine can't recover rapidly, then its politics starts to go wrong and you get into a bad situation, it seems to me.
You've laid out very clearly sort of what needs to happen. I guess the follow-up question would be how likely is that? I mean, President Macron opened a fundraising conference earlier this week that I think raised over €1 billion of pledges of aid to Ukraine. There are noises from the private sector. Do you think, how realistic is all of this discussion right now? Do you think when push comes to shove that there will be the kinds of funds put at Ukraine's disposal that are necessary? Or is this going to be one of those awful situations where there's lots of talk of big pledges, then actually, money is not going to be forthcoming?
I think there will be, you need two things, Annie. You need both government money to prime this recovery and to create the conditions for private capital to come in. But you also need a large supply of weapons, because that's what ensures that the peace holds. You need a deterrence against Russia launching another attack. So these are big demands, and they're coming at a time, as we all know, when there's a cost of living crisis, when the world economy is not going well. It's a big ask. The thing I would say, however, against all of that, is that the more the West understands that Russia is a threat and that the threat to Ukraine is in effect a threat to everybody else, the more generous it should be, because Ukraine is suffering immensely, and making Ukraine whole again and supporting it is a cheap way of dealing with the threat from Russia.
That's a very good segue to turn to a subject that Arkady started us off on, but we put on hold, which was President Zelensky's reiteration to him that, the goal needed to be the 1991 borders, which of course would include the re-establishment of Ukrainian control over Crimea. That's clearly something that is much, much more ambitious than that which Secretary of State Blinken has talked about, which is the pre-February 24th borders. Ed, sticking with you for a second, but I'm going to come to the other two as well. Is that a goal, do you think, that the West would actually ever support, the retaking of Crimea?
No one is prepared to come out and say, this is just off the table. We're not prepared to accept it. If you speak to officials, their public line is that this is for Ukraine to decide. And there's both a sort of practical reason for that, which is they don't want to get caught up in trying to decide exactly where things stop. That's a very uncomfortable position for government leaders to take. There's also a kind of moral thing here, which is this war is partly or largely about smaller country's right to determine its future against a larger, more imperialist neighbour that's trying to decide its fate in the world. So it's a bit odd for the United States to come in, or the European Union to come in and say you can't have Crimea. So it's sort of morally and rhetorically very difficult to say there's no way you can have Crimea. I've got a couple of things though that make me question whether in practice Ukraine will eventually take Crimea. One is just the military side of it, which Shashank is better able to answer than me, but I think it's a very big ask for Ukraine to be able to take Crimea back. The second is that if anywhere in any territory that Russia's taken in Ukraine is considered Russia proper by most Russians, it's Crimea. It's not the Donbass. And it's not going to be Zaporizhia province or Kherson province, it's going to be Crimea. And so I think if one is worried about escalation, that's where the worries are at the greatest. I'd say one last thing, again, which is that if the Ukrainian army can advance as far as Melitopol, then Crimea is within artillery range. And it may be that actually threatening Crimea is the best negotiating position for Ukraine to then try and negotiate finally a peace with Russia.
That's really interesting. Shashank, let's hear from you then, just from a sort of military perspective. How difficult would it be for the Ukrainians to retake Crimea?
I think extremely difficult. Russia has had not just 10 months to fortify this area, as it has in other parts of the front line. It has had 8 years to fortify Crimea. The Crimea is heavily militarized, in part facing the Black Sea, but also increasingly facing inside Ukraine. All the defensive preparations we see along the land bridge in Kherson province in Zaporizhia would be replicated in Crimea over time if that situation looked like it was developing. And here's the thing to remember, of course, when we had these conversations 4 months ago, the front line was very, very stretched. That's one reason why Ukraine was able to burst through. It has shrunk. The flanks have collapsed. The right flank in Kharkiv and the left flank in Kherson on the right bank, they've shrunk. And as in a situation in which Crimea was seriously in play, on the one hand, Russia's army may be in disarray, and that would be a prospect of collapse, yes. But also, you would have a much higher force density, many, many more Russian forces per kilometer of front in Crimea, because they would be concentrating on this as a last line of defense, depending on what happens on other parts of the front. And so I think it would be a serious military task. I think the priority here is, we have to remember, for the Ukrainians and for Zelensky, it's very important to him, isn't just territory. Of course that's important, but it's also broader considerations. For example, the defensibility of Ukraine's coastline in the Black Sea, where you could put anti-ship missiles, for example. And you don't necessarily need to take all of Crimea to be able to put substantial military forces along that southern coast, pushing the Russian Navy out and giving you a measure of safety.
Arkady, when you heard President Zelensky tell you very clearly, as he did, that 95% of Ukrainians, I think it is, support this goal, and that the goal had to be the 1991 borders, do you think he was talking with absolute conviction? Do you think this is a negotiating ploy? Do you think he really believes it? Having heard what Shashank and Ed have just told us, it seems implausible almost that the Ukrainians could do this. So talk us through what your sense is of this dynamic.
So this is a very good question. Zanny, the one thing that he was very certain and convinced, and I'm sure is convinced about, is the 95% figure. Now, this is 95% of Ukrainians who at the moment want to carry on and who want to go back to their land and who want to continue fighting. But this is the public opinion, this is public mood, and we know that public opinions change. And also this is the poll taken at any particular time. If it's taken after particularly heavy bombardment, it will be one thing. If it's taken 2 weeks later, it will be slightly different. What I think he is telling me and telling us is that he will be guided by what people want him to do, not by what he thinks necessarily constitutes the entire Ukrainian territory. If you remember when you and I talked to him at the end of March, he said it's not just about territory. Territory without people, without ideas, without our way of life is just a piece of land. It's about what makes Ukraine, what makes Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian nation state. And I think he is actually committed to that much more. In no conversations that I've had in Kyiv, neither in the presidential administration with Zelensky and his aides, nor really with Zaluzhny, did I get a sense that they're unrealistic and they're gang-ho and they want to go and march into Crimea. I think Zelensky is now talking about we can completely see sort of the return of Crimea by non-military means. And I think what he means by that is if Russia is defeated, if Putin is defeated, if there is a change of regime, and I think he is right. I think Crimea will be again, the status of Crimea will be completely renegotiated. Zaluzhny similarly, is talking about getting to the borders of Crimea, being able to strike the supplies that go through Crimea, because as he said in his article, and he reiterated to me, Crimea is the gravity center of this war. That's how Russia is supplying this war. He is not going to march into Crimea, I don't think himself either. There is even a question about where does sort of Ukraine in a way proper, or sort of where, does Donbass really is what people are prepared to have their sons, brothers and husbands go to, because there the dynamic changes. Already in some of the territory where Ukrainians are fighting, Russian airwaves, Russian radio, Russian television already reaches out. As Ukraine grows closer to the areas which had been occupied since 2014, they in fact go into hostile territories. This is where the people are just waiting, possibly for the Russians to arrive. They don't know, they don't particularly care. They don't have that sort of strong sense of identity that we see in Zaporizhia. As one of the businessmen, sort of chief executive of a very large company, Ukrainian company in Kyiv, told me, does he want to sit in Kyiv in a restaurant and know that somebody from Donbass who didn't want to be in Ukraine in the first place comes into the restaurant and sticks a knife into his back? And this is, I think, these are the questions which are very real, and they're going to start weighing on people's decisions, because what people want above all, they want a different Ukraine. As they said to me, they want Ukraine 2.0 without corruption, with an overhaul of the political system. And those things to them are much more important, all the things that Ed has been talking about, because without those, it won't be a victory.
Thank you. Let's shift our attention a little bit to another side aspect of this that we haven't talked about yet, which is what's happening within Russia. And we've had a number of questions along the lines of Philip, our subscriber, who asks, how do you assess the mood in the Kremlin after the cancellation of Putin's end-of-year press conference? Arkady, briefly to you, what's the mood and what should we make of the cancellation of that press conference?
Well, obviously, I'm not in Moscow, as you can see. There is no Kremlin behind my wall. The Kremlin is a black box. From what I hear, and this was very much confirmed in Kyiv, that Putin still thinks he can win. That he doesn't see it, as a defeat. He thinks he's got time on his hand. Indeed, if he thought otherwise, probably this war would be over by now. In terms of what the cancellation of press conference means, I think it means two things. One is unease, and we see it from opinion polls, however skewed they are, that the number of questions are growing about the conduct of this war. Very, very few people, a minority now, think that this war is going according to plan. There is a growing sense of confusion that is not yet resulting in any big revolt, and I don't expect it to be from sort of bottom up. I think the elites have completely now grasped the idea that A, this is unwinnable, this is a disaster, but also they have no way out of it themselves. And I think it signals another thing, the cancellation of the press conference. Press conferences were part of theater, which Putin had sustained throughout his rule, pretending Russia was somehow sort of consensual and democracy and just kind of taking longer and was not a North Korea, as it were. If it is a totalitarian regime, if it is a complete tyranny, and if Putin is really a tsar, then press conferences don't actually fit in well. I mean, stylistically, tsars and dictators don't give press conferences. This is what democratic leaders do. So I think this is sort of putting away there's both unease about answering questions, however selected they are, and appearing disingenuous, but also saying, well, press conferences are not for czars.
Press conferences are not for czars. That's one line. Let's talk about Belarus. We've had a lot of questions about Belarus. Michael, Laura, Mary Ellen, Klaas have all asked about Belarus, whether it will be pressed into joining the conflict and what impact would it have? Would it give the Kremlin access to a much needed amount of trained troops? And Shashank, maybe we'll just turn to you. Can you give us a sense of what military impact having Belarus join forces with Russia would actually have?
I think the answer is modest, and that's principally because of the state of Belarus's forces, limited training, low quality, potentially profound unwillingness to fight in the cause of a war in which they have watched as tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have been killed because of poor tactics. And perhaps above all, and the reason I think ultimately Belarus entering the conflict is unlikely, although I reserve the right to change that judgment as I see new indicators next year, is because they've given away lots of their material, as I said earlier. And I think that, to me, that's what I'm being told, and that points against an intervention. However, there are really strong incentives for Russia to be able to threaten an invasion from Belarus next year. And the principal one is that it ties down a lot of Ukrainian forces who have to screen the capital. They have to screen Kiev. And what that means is those forces cannot be used by General Zaluzhny for his offensive units, for his planned offensive, the offensive that he would like. We heard him say in the interview, my favorite line of Arkady's completely brilliant interview was Zaluzhny saying, may the men in trenches forgive me, because I'm saving up all these forces, I'm building up these reserves for the heavier, more protracted battles ahead. And the problem Zaluzhny faces is he has to allocate a portion of those reserves for screening Kiev if Belarus is potentially coming in. So even if it's a low probability, even if the combat ineffective, he has to prepare for that eventuality, and that really messes up his offensive plans.
We've got only, less than 10 minutes left and so many fascinating questions. I'm going to turn now to a very broad one, Ed, which is for you. This is from Francesco, who asks, what are the possibilities of an increasing Ukraine fatigue going into 2023? He's obviously referring to the West. Do we need to worry about Ukraine fatigue? How likely is it, and what would the consequences be?
Well, the first thing I'd say on that is that the key moment in this war was at the beginning, when you saw that public opinion in the West was spontaneously united behind Ukraine. And I think that set the pattern of Western support. That was the key moment. I think political leaders in the West might have let things slip, but actually there was massive support, and I think that's been reflected in Western support. And that was the key moment. If now, as we're seeing indeed, Ukraine starts drifting out of the headlines so that news bulletins don't cover it so much, it comes up here and there, people have lost a bit of interest, I still think the course has been broadly set, which is that leaders have realised this is an important war and it matters. So I'm perhaps slightly more relaxed about this than you might think, because I think in that sense the path was set. Having said that, one of the reasons why I think Zaluzhny wants to see advances is, as Shashank said earlier, that advances are important for seeing off the argument that really this is now the time to make peace, that this war is kind of over, it's just stalemate, and so you've really got to sort it out. So at the sort of level of Ministry of Defence planning and presidential and prime ministerial support, advances are important for people's continued belief that this is a cause that really is kind of worth supporting with lots of money and lots of arms. But at the level of public opinion, I think that the course is actually perhaps more set than that. And I don't know whether Shashank and Arkady would agree with me on that, but I feel the key moment was at the beginning of the war.
So I'm going to ask another question for you from our viewer Brian, who watched you last week when we were doing, I guess, the year in review event. And he points out that you mentioned that support for Ukraine from the wider world outside North America and Europe was much less significant than you'd expected. What, he asks, is the West doing wrong, and can it rectify this situation?
Well, I think there are a number of causes of that. One is a sense that the West jumps up and down when it suits it and kind of ignores things when it doesn't. So it picks the wars that it believes in and says this is absolutely crucial to everybody, and then ignores other wars. And you can think of Yemen, you can think of the war in Tigray. There are just lots of conflicts that the West has decided it can't do very much about. So there's a sense that the West is special pleading. I think there's also a belief that the West can be hypocritical, and so one would look at Iraq, for instance, there, and of course now I happen to disagree with both of those things. It won't surprise you to know, but that is the belief. And what can the West do about it? Well, I think it's been a bit of a wake-up call for the West, actually, and it means that perhaps some of the arguments that you might have thought would really carry weight, in particular, the argument that smaller and medium-sized countries should not wish for a world in which large imperialist kind of hegemonic countries like Russia that think they should be dominating their near abroad. A world in which they can dominate their near abroad is not one that many smaller countries should welcome. They should actually welcome a world in which the norms and standards are rather more protective of them than that. So what can the West do? There's some diplomacy to be done. There's quite a lot of sense that the West needs to build bridges. But this is the work of many years, I would say. And it's a reflection, I guess, of somewhat of how Western power in the past 2 or 3 decades has decreased.
Thanks. We've got time for a couple more quick questions, and there's a very specific one, Shashank, for you, which I think you're the only one of us who can answer. Alexander asks, what will be the effect of the underwhelming Russian military performance on their arms sales? Will they lose share to China and the West?
It's so interesting, and I always like to point out that let's not forget Ukraine has been using Soviet-designed arms as well. So, you cannot pin their catastrophic military performance down to their weapons in most cases, I believe. Look at Ukrainian air defenses that have done so much to repel the Russian Air Force. Well, they're S-300s, the same air defense systems that Russia is flogging around the world. Most of Ukraine's tanks are, old Soviet-designed tanks, and so on and so forth. So I always try and emphasize this point. Having said that, there is no doubt that other countries are looking at this and drawing some assumptions about the quality of Soviet equipment, Soviet-designed and now Russian-made equipment, particularly, for example, around things like electronic warfare, where we have seen a number of instances of fratricide between electronic warfare pods on Russian aircraft attacking each other's radars. And countries like India, I think, are looking at this. Countries that were already on a path to diversifying their arms sales, in India's case towards the United States and France, in the case of countries in the Middle East towards China, for example, buying increasing numbers of Chinese drones. Other countries will be looking at, not necessarily downgrading Russian systems, but looking at the fantastic performance of American ones, HIMARS launchers. Poland has bought 500 of these recently, for example. So yes, it will have an impact on weapon sales, but I think the always thing to remember is Ukraine has done a pretty good job with some of the same weapons. I always try and point that out.
That's really interesting and a really important point to remember. Arkady, a question for you from Owen, which is a really interesting question. What is the most effective way for ordinary citizens around the world to show their outrage at Russia? What can we do, he asks, or she asks, to have an impact?
I would say 2 things. One is, and the most important one, is help Ukraine by keeping pressure on your governments through legitimate democratic means, which you should not take for granted, and it's a great privilege. And I think just remembering that every time probably you receive your electricity bill, that this is the cost all of us are paying. This is not an isolated war, and helping Ukraine and continuing to support your government's that supply them with weapons and money, I think is one key element. And the second, I think actually think about supporting those who are now, and many of them are outside Russia, who continue to battle at considerable risk to their own lives, knowing Putin tactics with Putin's regime, because this war, as tragic as it is, it will probably end within Russia, and what will happen to it will again affect all of us. And supporting the resistant movement, whatever it is, through media or any other means, helping those who fight this regime that started this war of aggression, I think is just equally important.
And Ed, a last question for you from Ennius. Is there a way to make sure Russia will never start a war again?
Well, I think the most important thing here is to think of this war as a war of imperialism. This is about a country that has lost its imperial possessions, that feels it has a God-given natural right to be able to dominate the countries in its periphery. And it hasn't yet shed that view of the world. And until it does, it will remain a real danger to the countries in its periphery. So I think that the end of the idea of an ordinary Russia, and it may sound remote and impossible, but it's the kind of Russia that Alexei Navalny, for instance, who's presently in prison inside Russia for his beliefs, but that's the kind of Russia that he wants to create, a normal Russia, a nation-state Russia, not an imperialist Russia. And I think that is one of the things that this war is being fought over.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to find out more about our upcoming subscriber events, please click the link. And on the same page, you'll also find recordings of previous subscriber events, including our look back at the biggest stories of 2022.